G'day, this is Chris Savage from Our Real Ministries in Australia. Welcome you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. We're into session 18. We're looking at chapter 27, verse 12 to chapter 29, verse 20. And I pray that this will be a blessing to you and help you in your Christian growth. Okay, in the last session, we finished off with the message to the foreign ambassadors, which came into Judah, and that was in verses 1 to 11, chapter 27. Remember, Jeremiah did a symbolic action there. He made a yoke, some bonds and bars, put them upon his neck, and he also made several other yokes, and he gave them to the ambassadors from the surrounding nations who came into Judah. The meaning of this action is that God has chosen to give Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, which is his servant, God's servant, the authority of all the lands. In fact, God gave him authority over the entire earth at that time. And what this symbolic action means is that these nations need to submit to Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, the duration of Babylonian supremacy was going to be 3 generations. It's going to go down to Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Now, failure of these nations to put these yokes symbolically upon their necks was meant failure to put their necks onto the yoke of Babylon. And if they fail to do that, it will bring destruction. So they do have choices, including Judah. And that was submit to Babylon and survive, or rebel against Babylon and be destroyed. Now, Jeremiah gives a warning against the false prophets, and he specifically addresses Zedekiah and the nation of Judah. And he says to them, he says, do not listen to these false prophets. And the result of disobedience would cause Judah, if they listen to these false prophets, to end up in captivity in Babylon. However, if they are obedient, meaning the nation submits to and serves Babylon, that's all they had to do. Submit to the rulership of Babylon, and guess what would happen? They could remain in the land of Judah, and they'll be able to till the land, and they'll be allowed to dwell in the land and live in the land peacefully. However, we now have a message to Zedekiah, King Zedekiah, in verses 12 to 15. So Jeremiah has spoken to the foreign ambassadors and Zedekiah collectively. Jeremiah next turned in a private conversation to the king and addressed him with a specific message in verses 12 to 15. In verse 12, the prophet now spelled out exactly what Zedekiah must do. And I spoke to Zedekiah, king of Judah, according to all these words, saying, bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him and his people and live. That's your choice. Zedekiah must submit to the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve Nebuchadnezzar. If he does this, then he'll be allowed to live and continue as the king of Judah. And then verse 13 says that there'll be specific results for disobedience. Why will you die, you and your people, by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, as Jehovah has spoken concerning the nation that will not serve the king of Babylon? So if Zedekiah disobeyed Jehovah's command, he would be judged. And the judgment would come by one of the 3 elements of Jeremiah's triad, which we've seen previously, by the sword, by famine, or by pestilence. And this is in accordance with God's threat to the Gentile nations. So what God had already threatened the Gentile nations with, he also threatens Judah with, if they fail to submit to Babylon. So what the Gentiles were threatened with earlier, Israel is now threatened with here. And they must submit to Babylon in accordance with verse 11, which we did last session. In the first part of verse 14, there's further admonition not to listen to the false prophets, and hearken not unto the words of the prophets that speak unto you, saying, you shall not serve the king of Babylon. So Jeremiah is telling him, serve the king of Babylon and live. False prophets are saying, no, don't do that. And the reason we now have in verses, second part of verse 14 and verse 15, Jeremiah says, for they prophesy a lie unto you. For I have not sent them, says Jehovah. but they prophesy falsely in my name, that I may drive you out, and that you may perish, and the prophets that prophesy unto you. So what Jeremiah said earlier in a general sense, he now clearly spells out to Zedekiah personally. Jeremiah repeated that Zedekiah was not to listen to these impostors, these false prophets, because they were not sent by God and they prophesied falsely in his name. Now, if Zedekiah is going to choose their lies over God's true word through Jeremiah, he would bring exile and death upon himself, as well as those who prophesied to him. That's the choice they have. And now Jeremiah is going to talk to the priests and the people in verses 16 to 18. Well, in verses 16 to 22, actually. Now, we've seen the similarities here between the message given to the Gentile ambassadors and King Zedekiah. The same similarities exist with the third message, and this is to the priests and the people of Judah. Now, again, the theme of the message is a warning against listening to false prophets. And the passage is divided into two parts. First of all, we're going to see the warning in verses 16 to 18, and we see a special prophecy regarding the vessels of the temple in verses 19 to 22. So, verses 16 to 18, the warning against false prophets. First part of verse 16 identifies the people Jeremiah was speaking to. Also, I spoke to the priests and to all this people, saying, thus says Jehovah. Now, while his previous messages were addressed to the ambassadors of certain Gentile nations and to King Zedekiah, respectively, so it's nations first, Zedekiah second, Jeremiah now turned to the priests and all the people of Judah. And the message itself begins in the second part of verse 16 and concerns the lie of the false prophets. Hearken not to the words of your prophets that prophesy unto you, saying, behold, the vessels of Jehovah's house shall now shortly be brought again from Babylon, for they prophesy a lie unto you. So remember, this is now some of the vessels were taken into Babylon back in the first exile, 606, 605 BC, and other vessels were taken in the second deportation in 597 BC. So the Babylonians removed certain vessels and other furnishings from the temple. But the false prophets now lie and say that the vessels taken in the first and second deportation will shortly be returned back to Jerusalem. That's what they're prophesying. And Jeremiah's verdict regarding these claims was decisive. They were fabrication and lies. Do not listen to these guys. And then in verse 17, Jeremiah now spelled out the obligation of the priests and the people. Hearken not unto them. Serve the king of Babylon and live. Wherefore should this city become a desolation? So first of all, he says to them, they're not to listen to the false prophets. If the priests and the people obeyed Jehovah and decided to serve Nebuchadnezzar instead of rebelling against him, they would live. In fact, they would live in the land. And a second reason for obeying what Jeremiah was saying was that Jerusalem would be spared as well. However, because the priests and the people continued to listen to the false prophets, the calamity came upon them very soon. In verse 18, Jeremiah now gives the evidence as to why these prophets are indeed false. He recommends a test, and this test would prove the validity of the prophecies of the impostors. And he says to them, but if they be prophets, verse 18, if they be prophets, and if the word of Jehovah be with them, let them now make intercession to Jehovah of hosts, that the vessels which are left in the house of Jehovah and in the house of the king of Judah and at Jerusalem go not to Babylon. So what he's saying is, if you guys have been sent by Jehovah, and remember the qualification of a prophet was that the word of Jehovah was with them. So if you've been sent by Jehovah, well, entreat the Lord that neither the vessels of the temple nor the palace would go to Babylon. Because remember, there were still some vessels in the temple. They weren't all taken away. However, their intercessions were now proved futile. During the third deportation, so we've had 605, 606, 597. Now, during the third deportation and the subsequent destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, a mass spoiling took place in Jerusalem and the land. Not only were the temple's vessels taken, but also all of the valuables of the palace, as well as the houses in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was sacked. It was sacked by the Babylonians. And in verse 19 to 20, we have there the prophecy regarding the remaining vessels. Verse 19 to 22 contain Jeremiah's prophecy about the remaining vessels of the temple. Verse 19 lists these items. He says, "For thus says Jehovah of hosts, concerning the pillars and concerning the sea and concerning the bases and concerning the residue of the vessels that are left in this city." The pillars, not pillows, but pillars, are the pillars of Jachin and Boaz, which Solomon had made for the front porch of the temple. And they're also mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 21. The sea is the molten sea of 1 Kings 7, 23 to 26. And that was the large basin which was used by the priests for their own washing. And the term bases refers to the 10 bronze stands on wheels that supported the basins used for the rinsing the sacrifices. And that's in 1 Kings 7:27. Okay, so they're the things that are still left. Verse 20 now provides further explanation regarding the items that were still in the temple. This is verse 20. "Which Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took not when he carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from Jerusalem to Babylon, and all the nobles of Judah and Jerusalem." So, as mentioned previously, Nebuchadnezzar had carried off some of the temple treasures in the first two deportations, and that's in 2 Kings 24:13. But there are items left that could be carried off in 586 BC, and that's the second Kings 25:13 to 17. Now, verses 21 and 22 predict that these remaining vessels will be carried away to Babylon. Verse 21. "Thus says, yes, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, concerning the vessels that are left in the house of Jehovah and in the house of the king of Judah and at Jerusalem. They shall be carried to Babylon, and there they shall be." So Jehovah himself declared that the vessels that had been left behind by the Babylonians in the temple, the palace, and the houses of Jerusalem would eventually be carried away. And indeed, after the third and final deportation, none of the city's treasures were left in Judah and in Jerusalem. "They will remain there until the day that I visit them." This is again in verse 22. So, the day that I visit them, well, that will be until the return from Babylon. "Then I will bring them up and restore them to this place." So again, Jeremiah's favorite word is the word shuv, which means return, SHUV, and here it's used here. "I will bring them up and restore shuv to this place." Now, this is going to come after the 70 years of captivity in the year 536 BC. And with that, another chapter ends. Chapter 27 ends. Now, in chapter 28, verses 1 to 17, we're going to see a conflict with Hananiah. So chapter 28 describes this conflict between Jeremiah and a false prophet called Hananiah. The Hebrew name of the false prophet, Hananiah, translate to Yah has been gracious, or God has been gracious. Outside of the biblical account, we know nothing about him. Now, chapter 28 is going to be discussed in three parts. Hananiah's false prophecy in verses 1 to 4, Jeremiah's response in 5 to 11, and then Jehovah's response in 12 to 17. So, Hananiah's false prophecy. You see this in verses 1 to 4. This false prophecy challenged Jeremiah's prediction of a 70-year captivity. Verse 1 gives a historical background. It came to pass the same year, in the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 4th year, in the 5th month, that Hananiah, the son of Azor, the prophet, who was of Gibeon, spoke unto me in the house of Jehovah, in the presence of the priests and of all the people, saying. So, in the same year that Jeremiah admonished Judah and some neighboring nations to submit to Babylon, the conflict with Hananiah now arose. It was 594, 593 BC, the 4th year of King Zedekiah's reign. Hananiah was the son of Azor. Nothing else is known about him. He came from a place called Gibeon, which is a priestly city that was located around about 9 kilometers, 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem. You can check that out in Joshua 21, verse 17. Joshua 21, verse 17. Now, the message was directed to Jeremiah and was given to him in the house of Jehovah, meaning in the temple compound. Now, also present here were the priests and the people of Judah. In verses 2 to 4 is the false prophecy. Thus speaks, this is Hananiah, thus speaks Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. So Hananiah claimed that his message came directly from Jehovah, who stated that the yoke of the king of Babylon is broken. So when Hananiah spoke these words, Jeremiah was still wearing the wooden yoke he had made. It was still on his neck. So the connection between the false prophecy and Jeremiah's symbolic act back in chapter 27, first part of chapter 27, shouldn't be missed here. The second part of Hananiah's false prophecy in verse 3. Within 2 full years will I bring again into this place all the vessels of Jehovah's house that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, took away from this place and carried to Babylon. So Hananiah, false prophet, prophesied that Jehovah would return the vessels that he had taken from the temple. In chapter 27, Jeremiah mentioned the false prophets who'd been going around giving this same message. And one of these false prophets was this man called Hananiah. But now, this impostor went further out on the limb by specifying that this would happen within the next 2 years. Verse 3. Furthermore, he goes on to add that the Babylonian captivity would end and that the captives would be returned to Judah in verse 4. He says, I will bring again to this is him speaking on Jehovah's behalf, and I will bring again to this place Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, with all the captives of Judah that went to Babylon, says Jehovah. For I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon. This is Hananiah's prophecy, but he's speaking to Jeremiah. So the claim that God was going to break the yoke of Babylon, return the vessels that had been previously taken from the temple, and end the Babylonian captivity within 2 years, this was in direct contradiction of what Jehovah had really said. And that was through the prophet Jeremiah. So we see Jeremiah's response, verses 5 to 11. And this is his message to Hananiah. He begins in verse 5 with a list of people who are listening in. Then the prophet Jeremiah said unto the prophet Hananiah, in the presence of the priests and in the presence of all the people that stood in the house of Jehovah. So just as Hananiah had spoken his words in the presence of the priests and the people of Judah, so did Jeremiah. And the verse notes that the crowd was still in the temple compound. Jeremiah's response begins in verse 6. Even the prophet Jeremiah said, Amen. Jehovah, do so. This is Jeremiah saying this. Jehovah, perform your words which you have prophesied to bring again the vessels of Jehovah's house and all of them of the captivity from Babylon unto this place. Now, Jeremiah's response to Hananiah's prophecy was not necessarily sarcastic. He would have loved for Jehovah to return the vessels and the captives within 2 years. That would have been wonderful if he had done that. However, he knew the truth to be different. Therefore, the prophet Jeremiah warned Hananiah and stated in verse 7, Nevertheless, hear you now this word that I speak in your ears and in the ears of all the people. So Hananiah and the people were to take note of what they're about to hear. In verse 8, the words of the previous prophets agree more with Jeremiah than with Hananiah. Verse 8 says, "The prophets that have been before me and before you of old prophesied against many countries and against great kingdoms of war and of evil and of pestilence." So unlike Hananiah, the prophets who preceded Jeremiah did not announce peace to the nation. Their message was always one of doom. So their messages did not agree with what Hananiah had to say, but they agreed with what Jeremiah's prophecies were. In light of all of this, in verse 9, the test of Hananiah's prophecies will be this: "The prophet that prophesies of peace, and the word of the prophet shall come to pass, then shall the prophet be known that Jehovah has truly sent him." So, for the prophet who prophesies of peace, which goes contrary to the earlier words of Jeremiah and the previous prophets, the test will be here that when his words come to pass, then he'll be known as a true prophet, when peace comes upon the land. If his words come to pass as he spoke them, then he'll be known as a true prophet. And that's what Deuteronomy 18, verses 21 to 22 tell us. Deuteronomy 18, 21 to 22. On the other hand, if his words do not come to pass, then he'll be known as a false prophet. Now, at the time of the conflict between Jeremiah and Hananiah, the people of Judah could not tell who had stood in the council of Jehovah. And we see that back in Jeremiah 23, 18 and 22. Jeremiah 23, 18 and 22. They couldn't tell which of these prophets stood in the council of Jehovah and was a true prophet, because both men, both Jeremiah and Hananiah, claimed to be speaking in the name of Jehovah. So that is a challenge that Jeremiah now gave to Hananiah. Hananiah's response was to proceed even further with his stronger statements in verses 10 to 11. In verse 10 are his actions. Hananiah the prophet took the bar from off the prophet Jeremiah's neck and broke it. So Jeremiah had built the yoke earlier and had been wearing it up to this point. And that same yoke was now taken by Hananiah and broken by Hananiah. So having broken the yoke in his own symbolic action in imitation to Jeremiah, he now tries to interpret the meaning of his own symbolic action when he broke Jeremiah's yoke off his neck. Verse 11, "And Hananiah spoke in the presence of all the people, saying, Thus says Jehovah, even so will I break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, within 2 full years from off the neck of all the nations." It's not just Judah, but all the nations. Hananiah repeated his false claim that Jehovah was speaking through him, saying that within 2 years, the Babylonian yoke would be broken. That was his prophecy. Verse 11, second part, gives Jeremiah's response. And the prophet Jeremiah went his way, didn't even bother to respond. He left the area. He had said all he needed to say in verses 6 to 9. And the next 2 years would prove which of these two men was a true prophet and which one was the false prophet, because that's the time frame that Hananiah said these things would come to pass. Now we have Jehovah's response in verses 12 to 17. In response, God now confirms, in response to the conflict between Jeremiah and Hananiah, God now confirmed who his prophet was. His response begins in verse 12. "Then the word of Jehovah came unto Jeremiah after that Hananiah the prophet had broken the bar from off the neck of the prophet Jeremiah, saying," verse 7 now declares that a transition would take place. This is the word. "Go and tell Hananiah, saying, Thus says Jehovah, you have broken the bars of wood, but you have made in their stead bars of iron." So in contradiction to Hananiah's prophecy, the transition would not be from a wooden yoke to freedom, but to an iron yoke. By breaking Jeremiah's bars, which were wood, Hananiah put an even heavier yoke upon Judah. Why? Because his false prophecies had encouraged the people to rebel against Babylon. What did God say? Submit to Babylon and you can live in the land peaceably. But no, the false prophecies stirred the people up and they said, no, we're going to rebel against Babylon here. We don't want to have Babylon around. Then in verse 14, we have the message concerning Nebuchadnezzar. I have put a yoke of iron upon the neck of all these nations, and they will serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So not only has God given authority over the earth as far as humanity is concerned, but also the animal kingdom was given to Nebuchadnezzar by God. For thus says Jehovah of, this is verse 14. For thus says Jehovah of hosts, God of Israel, I have put a yoke of iron upon the neck of all these nations, that they may serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and they shall serve him. And I have given him, Nebuchadnezzar, the beasts of the field also. So whatever happened at the hands of the king of Babylon was according to God's plan, in contradiction to Hananiah's prophecy. And in verses 15 to 16, we now have a specific message to Hananiah himself. In verse 15, then said the prophet Jeremiah unto Hananiah the prophet, hear now, Hananiah, Jehovah has not sent you, but you make this people to trust in a lie. The sin of Hananiah was that Jehovah did not send him, yet he prophesied. Therefore, he causes the people to trust a lie. And because he causes the people to trust a lie in his office as a false prophet, in verse 16, God spells out judgment upon Hananiah. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, behold, I will send you away from off the face of the earth. This year you shall die, because you have spoken rebellion against Jehovah. Now, in the Hebrew, there's a bit of a word play between verses 15 and 16. The Hebrew word what we're looking at is shalach, meaning to send, S-H-A-L-A-C-H, meaning to send. In the past, Jehovah never sent, never shalached Hananiah, verse 15. However, now God was ready to send him, shalach, not as a prophet, but to his death. So he never sent him as a prophet, but now he's going to send him to his death as a false prophet. Now, false prophecy, even when made in the name of Jehovah, is always an act of rebellion. Check it out in Deuteronomy 13, verse 5. Because Hananiah had rebelled against God in this way, he was sentenced to death in accordance with the law against false prophets. Again, Deuteronomy 18, verse 20. Deuteronomy 18, 20. Verse 17 now records the fulfillment of that prophecy. So Hananiah the prophet died the same year in the 7th month. The fact that Hananiah died in the 7th month of that same year means that the prophecy of verse 16 was fulfilled 2 months after it was given. The death of Hananiah authenticated Jeremiah's message and prophetic office. While Hananiah's predictions never came true and he was therefore shown to be a false prophet, Jeremiah's prophecy regarding Hananiah was fulfilled within 2 months. And all of Judah knew that he was the one who stood in the counsel of God. And you can see that back in Jeremiah 23:18 and 22, Jeremiah 23:18 and 22. Okay. Now, the last chapter in this segment here, dealing with Jeremiah's conflict with the false prophets, is chapter 29. And this is going to deal with his letter to the captivity. We have 70 years of captivity in verses 1 to 14. Verses 1 to 3 provide the historical background to the first letter which he writes to the captivity. Verse 1 lists its recipients. Now, these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem onto the residue of the elders of the captivity, and to the priests, and to the prophets, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. So, the fact that we see the elders of Judah were in exile means that this letter was written after the second deportation, which occurred in 597 BC. The Babylonian Chronicle hints at internal troubles in Babylon in 595, 594 BC, in which some of the deported Jews seem to have been involved. Now, it's likely here that this letter was written in response to these disturbances, 595, 594, in order to counter the false prophecies of freedom from Hananiah. Jeremiah felt that he needed to tell the captives what the true word of the Lord was and how they were to behave in the time of their captivity. So remember that Hananiah had stirred them up, and so they were rebelling against Babylon, thinking, it's only going to be 2 years, we're going to break this yoke from off of us, but it didn't work yet that way. Now, besides Judah's elders, the list of recipients includes the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile during the first and second deportations. Now, among the prophets of the first deportation, which was 606, 605 BC, was Daniel. Daniel went down there to set himself up down there in government so that he could take care of the Jews when they came there later on. And then Ezekiel, another prophet, was taken to Babylon during the second deportation in 597. So by this time, there are two prophets down, two real prophets, two honest prophets, two true prophets in Babylon, Daniel and Ezekiel. In verse 2, the emphasis is upon the second deportation of 597 BC, because this was a time when Jeconiah, the king, and Nehushta, the queen mother, and some of the royal eunuchs, the princes of Judah and Jerusalem, and the craftsmen and the smiths were all taken into captivity. This was the second deportation, 597. And here in verse 2, after that, Jeconiah, the king, and the queen mother, and the eunuchs, and the princes of Judah and Jerusalem, and the craftsmen and the smiths were departed from Jerusalem. Verse 3 of 29 names those who carried Jeremiah's letter to Babylon. It was by the hand of Elasah, the son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent unto Babylon to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, saying. So, messengers were Elasah and Gemariah. As for Elasah, he was the third son of the godly Shaphan, which we saw back in Jeremiah 26:24. Jeremiah 26:24. And evidently, he believed in Jeremiah's word. Gemariah was the son of Hilkiah, the high priest under Josiah. We see that in 2 Kings 22, 3-14, 2 Kings 22, 3-14, and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35. Now, while these men carried the letter, Jeremiah's letter to the captives, it was actually Zedekiah, King Zedekiah, who dispatched them. It's unclear why the king did this. It doesn't say. But in the context of Jeremiah 27, remember when the surrounding nations came, their ambassadors came into Jerusalem, it appears that Nebuchadnezzar had heard about these ambassadors coming into Jerusalem, and he suspected a conspiracy on the part of Zedekiah. So Zedekiah sent Elasah and Gemariah to Babylon to explain the events of chapter 27. And so this gave Jeremiah an opportunity to send his letter to the captives. Okay. Verses 4-14 spell out the message of the letter, with verse 4 providing the introduction. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all the captivity, whom I have caused to be carried away captive from Jerusalem unto Babylon. So the letter was a message from Jehovah addressed to the exiles in Babylon. Verses 5-7 not only set the stage for the exile, but also for the worldwide dispersion. Listen to verses 5-7 here. Build ye houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives and beget sons and daughters. And take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, and multiply you there, and be not diminished. And seek the peace of the city whither I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray unto Jehovah for it. For in the peace thereof shall you have peace. Now, while the Jews are dispersed from the land, from Israel, they'll always follow these 4 admonitions. First of all, they'll build homes. They'll more or less plan to live for a long time in the place where they're located. Second, they'll plant gardens. They'll find a means of livelihood. They'll set up businesses and employment centers. They'll not assume that they will go home to Israel shortly. Third, they'll multiply in the land of their exile. Why? Because the Jews are not to diminish themselves through lack of marriage and birth. If they diminish themselves, it will only be by means of persecution. Or if diminishing comes, it's by means of persecution. The Jewish nation has been diminished because of persecution, not because of lack of birth. Fourth, they'll always seek the peace of the nation in which they dwell. They'll have peace when the nation has peace. Now, God's instructions concerning the behavior of these people during the Babylonian captivity, that became the foundation of the larger dispersion that occurred in AD 70. The principles he established in this passage have stood firm for nearly 2,000 years. In generally speaking, anti-Semitic campaigns occur when the host nations are in turmoil. For example, after World War I, Germany was in severe financial and social turmoil, and this climate laid the groundwork for the anti-Semitic campaigns of Nazi Germany that culminated in the Holocaust. On the other hand, when the host nation experiences peace and prosperity, then usually all is well with the Jewish people. And that's the case. It has been the case with the United States, which is a great haven for Jews. They were safe in the United States. However, we will see that anti-Semitism, it's beginning to rise, will rise even in the safe havens like the United States as soon as it enters a period of turmoil, which seems to be where it's heading at the moment. In verses 8 to 9, he warns them against the false prophets. He warned the Jews of Judah against false prophets, and now he warns the Jews of Babylon against them. In verse 8, for thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, let not your prophets that are in the midst of you and your diviners deceive you, neither hearken you to your dreams which you cause to be dreamed. So he said here that they should not be deceived by two categories of false teachers. First of all, the false prophets, and second, the diviners. They should not be deceived by the dreams that you cause to be dreamed. Notice these dreams do not come from God. Rather, these are dreams that they cause to be dreamed, dreams that they make up. None of what these impostors said came from Jehovah, but from figments of their imaginations. And in verse 9, for they prophesy falsely unto you in my name. I have not sent them, says Jehovah. So they should not be deceived because they prophesy falsely in God's name, and God has not sent them. Now, after warning the people against false prophecies, Jehovah declared in verse 10 how long the captivity would really last. For thus says Jehovah, after 70 years are accomplished for Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. This place was Jerusalem. Now, this is the second time that the exact length of the Babylonian captivity is spelled out. The first time was way back in chapter 25, verse 11. So when 70 years had passed, Jehovah would act on behalf of his people, and then he'd bring them back home again. Shuv is that return to the land, shuv. The means by which God would perform his good word is to cause them to return to this place. Again, his favorite word is the word shuv here. This is Jeremiah's favorite word, return or turn back. This is the promise for the short-term future. This is after the 70 years. So after 70 years of captivity, they're going to be allowed to return to the land. So for a 70-year period, they're to settle down in Babylon, build homes, marry, plant gardens, run businesses, and seek the peace of Babylon. But now, after he spelled out the short-term prophecy, now in verses 11 to 14, he deals with the long-term prophecy. And these verses here deal with the final restoration. Verse 11 reveals the thoughts of God toward Israel. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says Jehovah, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you hope in your latter end. So these are the thoughts of peace, not evil or calamity. So God's desire is to give them hope in the latter end. Now, the latter end places this in the prophetic future. He's not dealing with the immediate future of the 70 years from that date, as he did in verse 10, but he's now dealing with the far distant future, the far prophetic future. He'll elaborate upon the distant prophetic future when we get down to chapters 30 to 33 of Jeremiah. That's where we have the new covenant and things like that. Now, it was don't remember, but if you might recall, it was Daniel's inability to contrast between the prophecy of the return from captivity in the near future after 70 years and the return from captivity in the far distant future, which caused him to make his error in Daniel 9. I know we're not studying Daniel, but a little bit of history here. In Daniel 9, Daniel assumed that the millennial or messianic kingdom was going to be established at the end of the 70-year captivity. And that's why the angel had to come to Daniel and explain his misunderstanding of Jeremiah 25 and 29. Remember, he was reading Jeremiah's prophecies. Now, while it is true that the Jews will return from captivity after 70 years, the final messianic or millennial kingdom will not take place until another lengthy period, 70 weeks or 77s. Again, that's in the book of Daniel, not the book of Jeremiah. He's dealing with the far distant future, which Daniel misunderstood. That's Jeremiah. And the angel had to explain to him. Okay, back to Jeremiah. Verses 12 to 13 show that in the distant future, in the latter times, there will be a national regeneration of Israel. According to verse 12, Israel will call out to God. He says, and you shall call upon me, and you shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. According to verse 13, Israel will not only call out to God, but will also seek him. And you shall seek me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart. You notice the condition in this verse. Israel will seek the Lord and find him when the people search for him with all their hearts. Now, this is in keeping with Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29, which states, but from thence you shall seek Jehovah your God, and you shall find him when you search after him with all your heart and with all your soul. The prerequisite to Israel's final restoration is Israel's repentance, salvation, and prayer of confession. When Daniel misinterpreted Jeremiah 25 and 29, Daniel 9 is a prayer of confession. He thought the kingdom he was praying on behalf of the nation. He understood correctly that Israel's national confession precedes the final restoration. That's why he was confessing on behalf of the nation. He didn't understand that the final restoration of Israel would not come after the 70 years of captivity, but in the far distant future. Verse 14 describes the final regathering. And I will be found of you, says Jehovah, and I will turn again your captivity, and I'll gather you from all the nations and from all the places whither I have driven you, says Jehovah, and will bring you again onto the place where I caused you to be carried away captive. Okay, Jehovah promised that he would restore his people Israel. He would gather them from all the nations and from all the places where he had driven them. Now, clearly, Jehovah was not referring to just the Babylonian captivity, but to a future worldwide dispersion, because they're going to, in this instance, after 70 years, they're not going to come back from Babylon. But this is from all the nations. He's going to bring Israel back from all the nations in the distant future. And this promise is in keeping with the land covenant, right, which is one of the 4 unconditional Jewish covenants, and that's described in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 5. Deuteronomy 30, 1 to 5. Now we're going to see the misery of those who are left behind in Judah in verses 15 to 20. He deals with this other subject here, and this is the exiles in Babylon. Even though they may not think so, they are actually better off than the ones who are left behind in the land. And in these verses, he deals with the misery of those who were left behind in Judah. Verse 15 describes their sin. Because you have said, Jehovah has raised us up prophets in Babylon. Now, it's true that there were some prophets of Jehovah in Babylon, and two of these, as we said before, were Daniel and Ezekiel. However, the people of Judah were talking about the false prophets in Babylon, claiming that Jehovah had raised them up. And verse 16 lists the recipients of this message. Thus says Jehovah concerning the king that sits upon the throne of David, and concerning all the people that dwell in this city, your brethren that are not gone forth with you into captivity. So the message here was addressed to King Zedekiah, the people of Jerusalem, and all the other people of Judah who had escaped the first and second deportations. The judgment is now found in verses 17 to 18. God will send upon them the famous Jeremiah triad of the sword, the famine, and pestilence. Thus says Jehovah, verse 17, thus says Jehovah of hosts, behold, I will send upon them the sword, the famine, and the pestilence, and will make them like vile figs that cannot be eaten. They are so bad. And I will pursue after them with the sword, with the famine, and with the pestilence, and will deliver them to be tossed to and fro among all the nations of the earth, to be an execration and an astonishment and a hissing and a reproach among all the nations where I have driven them. So the people would become like the figs that were described back in Jeremiah 24, 1 to 10, split open and rotten. Jehovah would judge them also, again using the triad of sword, famine, pestilence, verse 18. God will deliver those that remain in Judah to be tossed to and fro among all the kingdoms of the earth. And in that way, there'll become four things among the nations to which God will drive them. First of all, a curse or an execration. Second, an astonishment or a horror. Third, a hissing. And fourth, a reproach. Now, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah show that only a minority of Jews returned from Babylon to resettle in Israel after the 70 years. The majority actually stayed in Babylon and continued in a state of prosperity for many centuries up until AD 600. That's a span of about 1,200 years. Those who returned to the land multiplied in number, but they also multiplied in their rejection of the scriptures. And this culminated ultimately in their rejection of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. When the Jews rejected the Messiah, those in Judah, not those in Babylon, but those who had come back to Judah and had multiplied, in AD 70, they experienced another judgment upon them. Those living in the land in AD 70 experienced a Roman judgment. Now, this was not just simply another exile and captivity, but this became a worldwide dispersion. So the long-term fulfillment is that those who were left in the land or those who returned to the land experienced the worldwide dispersion in which they were indeed tossed to and fro among all the kingdoms of the world. They became an execration, an astonishment, a hissing, and a reproach. Now, the reason why all this will come is found in verse 19. They rejected the prophets. They did not hearken to God's word, which he sent to them by his servants, the prophets. And because they have not, this is verse 19, because they have not hearkened to my word, says Jehovah, wherewith I sent unto them my servants, the prophets, rising up early and sending them, but you would not hear, says Jehovah. So in verse 20 is the admonition to those already in the captivity. Hear ye therefore the word of Jehovah, all you of the captivity, whom I have sent away from Jerusalem to Babylon. So those in captivity in Babylon are better off than those in Judah. They're better off, and therefore they should not make the same mistake as those who are back in the land in Judah, in Israel. They must not make the mistake of listening to the false prophets. False prophets in the land were obeyed. The false ones were, the impostors. Now the captives in Babylon said that God raised up prophets in Babylon, but these were also false prophets. They did not deal, the captives in Babylon did not deal with Ezekiel and Daniel. Therefore, those in captivity are better off than those in Judah. Hence, they must not make the same mistake. Otherwise, it could hurt them very badly. It will especially hurt a couple of individuals later on in this chapter, which we'll see in the next session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong. There are all our contact details there if you want to contact us for anything. Thank you.